Thank you. It's a great turnout. Thank you all for being here. Paul, as many of you know, is one of the most innovative economists we have today, and we're going to get into some of the things that he's been doing. We want to do this a little bit differently than usual, and as part of that, rather than as the moderator, sketching out what we're going to do, I'm going to let Paul do that.
Okay. So when Kitty approached me about doing a session like this, I suggested that there are lots of sessions at a setting like this where someone like me has to come in and adopt the stance of the expert. You can trust me because I'm always right and I never lie. And I suggested, why don't we have a session where we don't have to pretend to be experts? And since David and I were both going to be here, David and I talk frequently about a whole range of issues in economics on which neither of us are experts. And I said, why don't we just have the kind of conversation that he and I typically have offline, and range widely, and feel free to say what we say to each other, which is, geez, I have no idea. So with no more framing than that, one frequent theme or issue that comes up in our conversations is the iteration back and forth between the long run trends and then what's going on in the short run. And it's usually in a context like right now where the short run is kind of pessimistic. So this is also an iteration between a sense of long run optimism for the US or for the world or some other country. So long run optimism, but short run pessimism. And you were saying just before we came in that you're thinking about this for the U.S.
I have a hard time deciding whether to be optimistic or pessimistic. By nature, I'm optimistic, but that's not exactly an empirical analysis. And I see sort of two. I see an optimistic case and a pessimistic case, and let me sketch them each out and tell me where you side on them. So the optimistic case is, despite everything, despite the fact that we're already a rich country, despite the fact that we clearly have all these challenges that we know about, despite the incredible growth of Asia, the U.S. is responsible for roughly the same share of economic output today as it was in past decades, which is another way of saying there is no rich country that has a better recent record than we do, right? People talk about, well, China has this great record, but China's a poor country, and we're not. And so when you look at that, when you think about all the people who still want to come to this country, when you think about all the natural advantages we have, that's a reason for optimism. The reasons for pessimism are, if anything, more obvious, right? We have this terrible deficit that really is a problem over the long term. We've made promises we can't keep. Our educational attainment is not increasing as rapidly as other countries. We have just come out of not just a crisis, but of a decade in which we had slower average annual economic growth than in any decade. And so it looks like we're slowing down, and we have reasons to worry that things are going to get even worse. So what's the right balance?
Yeah. So on the long run, there is this trend that I think will overtake this issue of the constant share of world output, that as income per capita in China and India and hopefully everywhere else in the world converges with the U.S., just the sheer numbers of people outside the U.S. mean that we will end up with a smaller share of world GDP. That basically our share of GDP relative to the rest of the world's share of GDP is larger than our share of worldwide population. So if they all converge, which they, I think, are increasingly doing, eventually we'll have a smaller share of world GDP. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. I don't think we need to be concerned about the fact that they're growing faster, because they should. They're catching up. The issue is whether we grow slower than we could. And the way I've been framing this, and have gotten, depending on the day, more or less pessimistic, is just in thinking about our ability to make hard choices. We're clearly facing some big choices about budgets, about these promises we've made, about what to do to keep educational attainment moving forward. And my sense of the problem with our institutions right now is not one so much of the parties, but it's actually one of the executive branch versus the Congress. I think we have a pretty serious structural problem with a Congress that is not grappling effectively with decisions. That in some sense, as a body, ends up being profoundly irresponsible. And if you look at the continuity between many of the decisions between the Bush administration and the Obama administration, the executive branch, in the end of the day, has to figure out how to make things work, and they converge in on relatively narrow solutions. But the Congress, I think, is susceptible to a lot more manipulation. So the things that I think are optimistic are the ways in which we're starting to rein in the worst tendencies of the Congress. So the BRAC, the Base Closing Commission, which basically put limits on the ability of Congress to log roll and manipulate any package of legislation about closing military bases. I think that's been successful, and I think this IPAB, the new Independent Payments Board for Medicare, might finally give us an ability to make decisions about healthcare spending. So I think a really interesting test in the next 6 to 12 months is whether that independent payments panel survives. And I think there's reasons to think it could get severely attacked in some of these crisis negotiations from both Republicans and Democrats in the Congress.
And I assume the reason it's gone through different names, right? I think its last name is IPAB, right? Which is, it's the idea where you have a group of experts who look at the evidence on what healthcare actually makes people healthier and what healthcare doesn't. And they say, okay, Medicare is going to skew more toward things that actually work, that actually make a difference. That if there's a drug for $1,000 and a drug for $100 and they're equally effective, we're going to fund the one for $100. If you want to get the one for $1,000, you got to pay an extra $900. A lot of people are skeptical that something like that can work, that you can centralize that much decision making in one place. Both, I think, on the substance and on the politics, right? We are not a country that's that comfortable with centralism in many ways. You seem more optimistic about it.
Yeah, well, we did it with the BRAC, and I think there's some evidence that the Veterans Administration is doing this as well. That they're managing the trade-off between cost and effectiveness better than the rest of the system. So I think we can do it, and the question is whether this panel gets a chance to see the light of day, because I'm worried it'll get basically written out of the legislation even before it has a chance to make some decisions.
And there's this fascinating history here, which is that there have been small versions of this already, where you try to tie Medicare decisions more to evidence. And the problem is that there are obviously people who benefit from healthcare that doesn't make people healthier, right? If you make the $1,000 drug, and so it short circuits it.
Yeah, I mean every dollar of cost savings in healthcare is a reduction in income for somebody. So it's very hard stuff.
Is there? Let's.
Actually, I want to turn the tables and ask you a question about the healthcare, because you've been following this better than I have. What's your reading about what happened in the period of time where we had the HMOs? Because when the HMOs were expanding in the U.S., it looked like we were getting this same kind of better management of cost, and then somehow that wasn't sustained. It fell apart. It looked like HMOs were really going to spread and take over. So do you have a sense of what went wrong there?
It's funny because there's something that went hugely right. If you look at healthcare costs in this country, there is an incredible slowdown in the 90s during the HMO period, and that had, I believe, you can't ever prove it because we don't get to run this period again with an independent trial, but I think it had a huge effect on people's wages. One of the reasons that wages rose so fast in the 1990s, one of the reasons why it's the only period with really good wage growth since the productivity slowdown began in the early 1970s, is the slowdown of healthcare costs. It's not the only reason. Fast economic growth is a big reason too. But if you're an employer, right, you don't have some magical pot of money to pay for health benefits. You have a pot of money to pay for compensation. And the more of it that goes toward health benefits, the less of it that you're going to be able to pay people in salary. You actually see this in a very granular basis in certain negotiations, like the union negotiations in New York for doormen. I mean, you really saw the dollar for dollar trade-off. And so in that way, HMOs worked. But I assume if we asked you, well, what do you think about the great HMO success story, you would say, what? Yeah. And so we don't think of it as a success story, in part because basically HMOs told us no in a way we didn't want to hear. We have to learn how to say no on healthcare, right? Yeah. Our ability to treat exceeds our ability to pay, or at least it will. And so in some ways you can look at the HMO thing and you can say, wow, there's an example of restraining healthcare costs. But now we got to figure out a way to do that people don't rebel against.
Right.
Is that consistent with your?
I was interested in this partly because my wife then was, when her first job was actually at an HMO, so I was kind of watching firsthand the HMO, and I thought the quality of care, this was in Rochester, New York, where there were two corporate leaders, Xerox and Kodak, that really pushed for the development of the HMOs. And I thought the quality of care was great, and I was always puzzled about the backlash against it. And I wondered, one, if this was really just a kind of a response from the medical community that was worried about the costs, basically that the doctors weren't ready to move to a salary model as opposed to a fee-for-service model. So one possibility, what happened was there was a big movement towards formation of these PPOs, the preferred provider organizations that were not like HMOs, but doctors could still maintain some version of the fee-for-service. So it's possible that the HMOs were stopped by the PPOs and interests that didn't want to see constraints on salaries. But it could also have been dissatisfaction by consumers. And I don't know, I haven't seen any research on this, and I don't know if you've looked back at that time. Is your sense it was kind of the consumers who were worried about the?
My sense is it was both. I mean, I think I think there are special interest problems we have that are a drag on growth, but I also think that public opinion can be, unfortunately, a big drag on growth and can be a big economic problem. I mean, the best example of that right now is I think the public is strongly pro-deficit in this country, right? If you ask the public, are you pro-deficit? Of course they say, no, the deficit is terrible. It's the most serious problem we have. I'm against it. Do you want to pay higher taxes? No. Do you want to have any changes to Medicare, Social Security, or the military? No. Well, that's being pro-deficit, right? And so I think there's something somewhat similar. In fact, it's directly similar in this healthcare thing, right? Which is we don't ever want to be told no. We also don't want to pay more. And so it then gets wrapped up in this other thing, which is insurance executives as a class are roughly as popular with the public as journalists and lawyers, right? Doctors are at the very top, right? Yeah. And so if it's an issue of insurance executives being the ones or insurance employees being the ones saying no, I don't think that is sustainable long term. I think we have to build a model in which the doctors are more a part of saying no.
The thing that was interesting about HMOs was that it integrated the insurance company with the provider of the healthcare. And so that could avoid this case of paying way too much for something that didn't provide much care. The one thing that I saw was that it did leave the individual feeling somewhat trapped. That if you got a decision from like your HMO that you didn't like, and some of these healthcare decisions are incredibly emotional decisions, there wasn't a good mechanism to go someplace else because at that point you've got a pre-existing condition, your insurance company is your provider, you can't stay with the insurance company and go to somewhere else. So I always wondered if we had found a way to let people who felt trapped move to another HMO, that might have saved it. But the other thing that happened then in the 90s was I think a lot of the HMOs were actually nonprofits, and we saw this huge move towards turning into for-profits, nonprofit parts of the healthcare system. And that, I think, is something which, in retrospect, we may view as having been a big mistake.
Because?
I think the for-profit sector is going to be more aggressive at lobbying for government policies that reward their organizations financially. And particularly when you have single individuals who can have multi-million-dollar bonuses or stock options contingent on a particular decision about reimbursement from Medicare, that creates a very strong kind of lobbying force for decisions by the government that I don't think you would have gotten from organizations like Kaiser or the kind of HMO that I was working with. So I worry that this combination of for-profit provision using a lot of government resources is a kind of, and then with a Congress, which is very susceptible to manipulation, I worry that creates a cycle that is really hard to get control over.
Let's do one more thing on healthcare. This McKinsey study that predicted a lot of employers were going to abandon employer health insurance recently got a lot of attention. It seems to be somewhat flawed in how it was conducted, but let's set that aside for a minute. My reaction was great. I want employers getting out of the business of healthcare. It is incredibly restrictive of people's freedom. I can't pick which insurance I want. The New York Times gives me a choice of 3, I think. A lot of people have no choice. Do you disagree?
No, I agree. I agree completely. That tying tying the worker to the worker's insurance to the firm is a really bad thing, and that, you know, especially if you get stuck in one of these conditions with a pre-existing condition, you can really get trapped. So it ought to be much easier to stick with your insurance company, and ideally your provider, even if you move jobs, change parts of the country.
Why do employers like it?
You know, this is one of those areas I don't think I know. And also why are unions so strongly in favor of this system as well? I think both the unions and some of the employers have really wanted to preserve the system. So like there was this thing that got axed in the last budget showdown, which was basically an opt-out that would let individuals take their insurance dollars to a firm an insurance firm that they select, right?
Yes.
This is Widening?
Yes, so Ron Wyden was pushing and pushing and pushing for this, and he finally got, I'm sure there are people here more expert in this than me, finally got this tiny little waiver put in, which for some small numbers of people, if your insurance was sufficiently expensive, you could basically enter the exchange even if you had employer-provided health insurance, right? So what we're going to do in health reform, if it survives, is we're going to set up these exchanges, and we're going to say, if you don't have health insurance, you can go into this exchange, and you can pick from any numbers of people. Well, if you are employed and you do have health insurance, you can't choose, right? You have to take whatever your employer gives you. And Ron Wyden was trying to get the camel's nose under the tent just a little bit by saying, we're going to have this exception. And insurance companies didn't like it, right? Because it would make their lives harder and they'd have to compete more. And in a budget negotiation, someone got it killed. Yeah.
So this is this thing I worry about these budget crises that are teed up, is that this was in the budget negotiation that was right the night before we were supposed to have the government shutdown. And this provision got axed, and what I read, and you're probably closer to this than I, what I read in the New York Times, and God knows if you can trust them, but you know, by the way, is this Times movie going to dish out a lot of dirt? Or
I haven't seen it. I've consistently heard that it makes us look good from people in and outside the Times, and I've heard, which of parochially I care about, and I've heard mixed things about how good it is.
Okay, well, but what I read in the New York Times suggested that the labor unions and some of the business organizations were both trying to kill this Wyden provision.
Well, so the cynical view of that would be, right, what do unions and employers have in common on this? The money flows through them. Yeah. Right? So
somehow they don't want more mobile employees. They want just more control.
It doesn't make sense to me for employers, but obviously it's reason.
So we'll do a contest, but I have a suggestion about where we could go next, which is education.
Great, that was my idea.
Which I know is something that you care a lot about. But
yes, we are. We'll do that at the end, if that's okay.
Could we save them for the end? Is that okay?
I'd actually like to hear a big idea, and I haven't heard one yet. We have enormous corporate control.
Yep. Well, you know, we'll come hear your session and talk about those things. So let me tell you what I'm worried about with higher ed, because right now we're just in the early stages of doing in higher ed what we did in healthcare, which is creating some very important for-profit companies that provide higher ed. They are very dependent on federal government support and regulations for their business model. They get a very large fraction of their tuition revenue from students who get guaranteed aid from the federal government. And in the same budget negotiation that killed the Wyden proposal, there was a very intense lobbying effort to try and get the education department not to enact some regulations that basically said that if you're a for-profit higher ed institution and you have a sufficiently high default rate, or your students don't earn enough to pay off the loans they take out to pay your tuition, then we're going to cut off access to student loans for you. So seemingly a perfectly reasonable thing to come out of the executive branch. There was a lot of support in the Congress to stop the Department of Education from letting those regulations go through. And I think it's a sign of something that we have to worry about going forward, about shifting from the nonprofit private higher education institutions to more reliance on these for-profit higher education institutions who lobby for things that the nonprofits never lobbied for.
I'm a little less concerned about for-profits. I'm more concerned about how little accountability there is for not-for-profits. That I think the for-profit is problematic, but I think it's sort of second-order problematic. And to me, the first-order problematic is how much money we spend in education, both higher and K-12, without any accountability, right?
Yep.
I mean, my little pet thing that I like to promote is what West Virginia has done, where they give one of these fairly generous scholarships, but they say you only get to keep it to the students if you remain on track to graduate in 4 years.
Yeah.
And I think we need much more of that on both the kind of student and the institution side. And it would actually, I think, deal with some of these for-profit issues, right? Because one of the worries with for-profits is basically they're just taking government money and they're not educating kids.
It's like the joke that in Russia that they pretend to pay us and we pretend to work.
Yes, exactly.
And you know, we've seen this frequently in the United States with various forms of, you know, like Veterans Administration support for veterans to go to like drafting schools when I was a teenager. And often these schools don't actually teach anything valuable. So if you could measure more accurately what the institution provides, then more competition would be a good thing.
Yeah. Let's come back to this Congress point. So let's think about the ways in which Congress is an impediment to good policies. First on the policies part, and then we'll do the institutional. What to you are the things we could do now that would best help us in this country improve our long-term growth prospects?
Well, I mean, I guess I keep wanting to jump to the institutions, which is the capacity to just make hard choices. So, you know, mechanisms that would present to the Congress something where they have to have an up or down vote on, say, a budget measure.
Mainly because it reduces the influence of special interests?
Yeah. That you're forced to make decisions that then maximize things for the nation as a whole. And the reason the Congress, I think, is irresponsible is that it's a committee of hundreds and hundreds of people, and each person can promote a particular agenda that they're interested in, that the people they speak to are interested in, and those may all be good agendas, but they don't ever have to worry about how it all adds up. And that's what is different about the executive branch, is they got to make it all make sense, be coherent. In the Congress, they don't. But if you don't have that choice to just push a little bit more there, but just vote up or down, is this better or not, then I think we'd make good policy.
And is there any kind of reform, even setting aside political viability for the moment, of Congress that you'd like to see?
Well, I think more expansion of these BRAC-like mechanisms.
You don't actually reform Congress, but you basically reform the sort of process.
Yeah, well, so Congress voted to say for base closings that there's a commission that will present to us a set of proposals of military bases that should be closed, and then we're going to vote up or down on that proposal. So they, in a sense, took away the power that they used to have to negotiate amongst themselves about which bases got closed and which didn't. And I think it would be, you know, promising if the Congress recognized finally that on things like budgets, they're going to have to do the same thing to themselves. And my impression was that it was actually people like Jay Rockefeller from the Congress who were pushing this for Medicare spending, because they could see that collectively they weren't making good decisions on this. So my optimistic scenario is that Congress adopts more of those kinds of mechanisms. Then what policies would change if they did that? I mean, this is one area where I think you and I agree. In the long run, education policy is the most important thing we do, because it both speeds up growth and equalizes the distribution of income, make sure that everybody benefits from the growth. So I think better attention to government policy toward growth would be ultimately the single most important thing we could do. And part of what I think would be required there is exactly what you were mentioning a minute ago, which is more measurement of what the outputs are from the educational system, so that when institutions compete, when kids decide where to go, when the government decides who to support, it's all based on demonstrated performance rather than reputation.
One of the amazing things to me is that people don't even often think about graduation rates when they're sending their kid to college. Now, if you're deciding between Williams and the University of Michigan, it's not that big a deal. But if you're deciding between schools at almost any other tier, there is huge variation in college graduation rates. And this isn't simply an issue in which it's the inputs that matter, right? There's this great work that's recently been done by Mike McPherson and Bill Bowen. If you take two identical kids and you send one of them to the University of Northern Colorado, where my brother-in-law is a professor, so I'm not denigrating it. He would tell you this himself. And one of them to CU Boulder. The kid who goes to CU Boulder is more likely to graduate. There's a culture of graduation. There are more resources. And yet, when people are thinking about colleges, graduation rate doesn't come into the picture at all.
Yeah. I don't know if you're, there's a paper I wrote about this sort of supply and demand for engineers, where I was encouraging the government should think more about increasing the supply of engineers rather than increasing the demand for engineers through things like the R&D tax credit. But in the beginning of that paper, I did an exercise where I sent a graduate student out to apply to a bunch of different graduate programs in science and in business to see if you get any information about placement rates. So in PhD programs, the issue is not so much graduation rates, but placement rates. If you get a PhD from this program, do you actually get placed, and what's your starting salary? And many of these hard science departments don't give you any information at all about the placement rate. So it's really remarkable how students go to these schools with no idea about whether or not they're actually going to get a job when they go out. So it's this same kind of indication that somehow as a market, this one isn't working very well. At the undergraduate level, one of the things that I found was that the engineering schools like MIT and Harvey Mudd both give you information on their website about average starting salaries for their graduates. But if you look at Stanford and Harvard, they won't give that, partly because their average starting salaries aren't that great for a number of the kids who come out of some of the programs that really don't prepare them very well for the market. So I think a combination of policy and then just public pressure should push places like even Stanford and Harvard, let alone University of Northern Colorado, to demonstrate more what value do they actually add? What do people really get when they go there?
There's so much skepticism about education now, right? Kids don't spend a lot of time in class. They don't spend as much time studying as they used to, which is empirically true. Yep. They emerge with huge debts. China's going to take all our jobs anyway. A lot of college graduates are unemployed today. Yep. I have tried on a number of occasions to bat back that skepticism in the New York Times, and anyone can read my attempt to do so. But I'd be interested in yours. How do you... are there any important grains of truth in that? And how would you try to persuade people that education isn't overrated if you think it's the key to our long-term growth?
I think you're pushing correctly to remind everybody that it's incredibly valuable, and therefore that part of our policy should be to increase completion rates and increase enrollment rates. We should keep moving up on that. And I've actually said something I think you wrote recently too, which was that we used to think that secondary school was a luxury, and we shifted the idea, well, secondary school education is just universal. And we should probably start thinking about how we're going to organize universal tertiary education as well. So that should be where we're going. Where I give, I guess, a little bit of credit to the skeptics is on this dimension we were just describing, which is that some parts of higher ed do a much better job than other parts of higher ed, and that even as we say, on average, it's better to have more of this, it would be good to start to bring a little bit of skepticism about, let's not only have on average more higher ed, but let's also have more of the kind that really makes people better citizens, better employees, whatever those things are that we want more of. But right now we just don't measure it. So the criticisms that are on the kind of the quality dimension, I think, are not necessarily unwelcome.
So you said you're long-term optimistic, short-term worried.
Well, actually, let me mention just one more thing about education, which got my attention recently. There was a study that showed that if you take a Mexican immigrant to the United States and then look what happens to his or her wages when they go back to Mexico and work in the same industry that they worked in the United States, a year of employment in the United States raised their wages by more than a year of schooling in Mexico. So that's the other kind of interesting way that this is a question which I think much more relevant for developing countries than the US. But what many developing countries forget is that there's an enormous amount of skill that can be acquired on the job. And so part of human capital policy in a developing country is to make sure that everybody, as soon as they leave school, whenever they leave school, that they get into a job, and ideally a formal sector job. So a job with a firm that's in the formal sector, where these firms typically have more high-skilled managers with whom they work, and they learn more modern practices about communication, teamwork. And so in much of the world, even as they have to think about increasing enrollment rates, for the big bulk of the population, which is already past school-going years, more employment might actually be as valuable for skill formation as more schooling.
I actually think that's a good example of making the case for education in this country, because there's nothing like that in this country, right?
Yeah.
There's basically no broad-scale thing that you can do to lift the wages of people in this country besides education, right? We can come up with exceptions. Mark Zuckerberg and Bill Gates dropped out of school, et cetera, right? Some college graduates are unemployed. But there's nothing like that to say this is actually a great substitute to education.
I just gave a talk where I said, school is work and work is school. And the point I was trying to make was partly that good schooling is actually no fun and is hard. And that some of the things that I think we're seeing as less effective performance in schooling is that we aren't creating the measurement and the incentives for hard work. But then on the flip side, work can also be school, especially in many parts of the world where you have huge numbers of people who are neither in school nor employed.
Let's talk about the short term. Right?
Yeah.
There are all kinds of reasons to be worried about the short term. We have millions of people unemployed. We have an economy growing that's not really fast enough to employ any put any numbers of them back to work.
Yeah.
The Washington seems to have lost its appetite for doing things, right?
Yeah.
And so what if you had a chance to say to John Boehner and Barack Obama, hey, here's what I would try. What would you try?
Yeah, well, but before we get to that, let me be even more pessimistic about the short run. I think there's a non-trivial risk of something very traumatic emerging out of this crisis in Europe. I think there's one issue that everybody's talking about in Greece, which is basically whether the government can pay off its debt. And there's a lot of talk about, well, ultimately, if they can't pay off their debt, then you have a haircut, a workout, a reprofiling, and some of the people who are going to collect on the debt don't get as much. But there is another problem in Greece, which is that the wages and costs of business there are not competitive with the rest of Europe. And so they run this chronic trade deficit with the rest of Europe, and that's financed only through borrowing. The only proposal for adjusting that lack of competitiveness is to run basically a deep recession or depression in Greece long enough that wages and prices come down, and that'll restore competitiveness with the rest of Greece. And this may just prove to be politically unviable, so that we may be looking at not just this reprofiling or reworking of the debt, but some risk. I think it's now a non-trivial risk that Greece will leave the euro. And that process, there were no provisions for how a country could do this. And it's going to be very, very messy and very, I think, potentially damaging for the financial system. So we not only are starting from a position of weakness in the United States, but we may be in a world, we are in a world where there's a risk of a big shock that could happen, and we're just not well prepared to deal with it.
You're basically arguing that Europe is a bigger risk for the global economy right now than the debt ceiling.
That's because I assume that the debt ceiling will get resolved. I think most people think this. I mean, the interesting thing is going to be what's going to be that last-minute demand that has nothing to do with the budget that gets thrown on the table in the negotiation that's debt ceiling. So we'll look in the New York Times the morning after they do the agreement and see what got.
I agree with you.
away.
The one thing that makes me nervous about the debt ceiling is the unnamed quotes you read from congressional aides saying some version of, maybe this wouldn't be so bad. I don't know how serious that is, right? Is that unnamed congressional aides to people who actually have major influence in Congress?
Yeah.
Or is it unnamed congressional aides to people who aren't going to vote for this when it passes anyway? But if there's the notion that there's some upside to doing this, both because of how it would force us to make hard choices, or if one side thinks it has political advantage and upside, then it could be really bad. I still think that's not the likely scenario, but but I've read more of those anonymous quotes than I would have than I would like.
Yeah, I mean, my guess is that we'll get some negative feedback, some immediate feedback very quickly. I mean, within a day, about how bad it is
on interest rates.
Yeah, interest rates in financial markets. So that even if some people feel like, well, let's take a little risk and see what happens here, I think the system will respond within a day or two. But it's not good. I was actually talking to somebody who's in business who was telling me about kind of holding back a little bit about investment decisions because of the debt ceiling. So it's really we're shooting ourselves in the foot to be adding even more uncertainty unnecessarily over this issue. But that still leaves open the question. Suppose we get through that. There's some risks in Europe, and we're growing very slowly here.
Right. What do we do?
I think one thing the Congress could do would be to stop putting pressure on the Fed to do nothing. So I think the quantitative easing has had some beneficial effects, and I think we should encourage the Fed to think about the other part of its job, which is or the real part of its job, which is its job is to stabilize inflation at something like 2% or higher, and so we should be trying to increase inflation right now.
The amazing thing to me, and I think Bernanke and the Obama administration have been operating within incredible constraints, and within those constraints have often done a good job. I think in 2009 they did a good job. I think in 2010 they didn't. And what's amazing to me is that these were the public officials who understood this history perhaps better than anyone. I mean, I interviewed Geithner in the transition office a couple weeks before the administration took office, and he said the mistake the Japanese made, the mistake that Roosevelt made, was too much stop and start, right? You do some stimulus, you try to have the public sector step in when the private sector, both businesses and consumers, are pulling back, but then it doesn't work immediately, and you confuse, these are now my words, not his, you sort of confuse the fact that it's not working with the idea that it doesn't help at all. It becomes politically unpopular. Bernanke is very conscious of how unpopular post-crisis action is. I mean, anyone in any government around the world has to be conscious of that now, because it doesn't matter whether you're a right-wing government or a left-wing government. If you were in office when it happened, you've basically gotten tossed out, right? And we in this country may do it twice, right? We may toss out the Republicans in 2008 and the Democrats in 2012. And so they were incredibly well attuned to this, right? Yeah. What Geithner said to me is, we're just not going to make that mistake. We're not going to do it. I mean, it's in the New York Times Magazine. You can go find it. And that's what they did. They were, to quote Jared Bernstein, who I believe is going to be here this week, there were too many people smoking green shoots, right? Which is, they thought they saw a reason for good news, and then they just sort of glommed onto that. And I understand they were operating within constraints, but that's a version of what you're talking about with the Fed now saying, there's a lot more to do, and we're done.
Yeah, right.
I mean...
Let me use this. This is a place for me to sneak in something I always try and get in, which is that I'm not related to Christina Romer, who is the...
Or David Romer.
Or David Romer, who's Christina's, is another macroeconomist who's Christina's husband.
Okay, so
many people think I would. But when Christina was head of the Council of Economic Advisors, I haven't ever, asked her about... I think she was on this side that was pushing for more at the time, but I don't know.
Okay, so more aggressive Fed stuff. What else?
Well, I think the other thing might be to try and be more explicit about the committing to a policy which is basically less tight in terms of fiscal policy in the short run and more tight in the long run. So there's a number of people who have suggested something like a payroll tax holiday or a cut in the payroll tax. We could tie that to a formula that says we'll reduce payroll taxes aggressively until the unemployment rate reaches such and such a level, and then we'll raise the payroll tax above what's now the current legislated rate until it collects as much revenue as the interest cost on the foregone collected revenue during the period of the tax holiday. So we could have not only a tax holiday, but then a commitment for above average payroll tax rates during the following boom. Well, no, it would be on balance sheet because we would be borrowing, but it's just a commitment to counter-cyclical fiscal policy with your tax rates. Some people are arguing, in effect, you'd get so much revenue by it's kind of like a supply side argument from the left now, that you'd get so much additional employment that with the payroll tax holiday, you don't need to have the higher tax rates later. But if politically this is what we need to get the deal done, I think it would be more than worth it to commit to significantly lower payroll tax rates now, but then higher payroll tax rates afterwards.
Yeah. Let's talk for a minute about cities before we open it up. Why don't you just describe charter cities briefly? Because I'm always left talking about Hong Kong, and that's not the best way to do it.
Yeah, well, and this is partly something I'll talk about when I pretend to be an expert on Thursday. So people can come hear me then. The motivation and the things on which everybody agrees are that urbanization is going to be this overwhelmingly important phenomenon in this century. 3 to 5 billion people is the estimate of the number of people who will move into cities in this century, which is more than live in cities now, more than we've gotten into cities in all of human history. And this could be done in a way which is very beneficial in terms of employment opportunities and skills acquisition, and even reducing the kind of the footprint, the ecological footprint that humans have on Earth. But on the default path, it may not play out that way. We need a lot of investment in urban infrastructure to make these cities livable. You need a sewer, a water system in a city. And you also need rules that make cities safe, so that, for example, you don't have crime, that you don't have ill health. So the question I'm posing is there a way to create entirely new cities rather than just expand the existing cities in the developing world? And to do this where you encourage direct foreign investment in the infrastructure that these new cities will require. It links in a weird way with the discussion we were just having, because if you step outside the US context and think about the whole world right now from a medium-term macroeconomic perspective, the whole world faces this problem of insufficient investment demand. Basically, every country in the world wants to export more right now because it wants to save more and consume less. But they can't all export more. So there's this challenge of, if the whole world is saving more, where are we going to do the complementary investment that more savings has to generate, just from a pure accounting perspective.
Why is that the case right now? Why don't we always have this problem? Why do we have it now?
Well, because of the excessive run-up of debt.
Okay.
And that what's happening is that we're trying to deleverage. And so households are saving more, governments are going to need to save more. So national savings rates are going to go up. Arithmetically, that just means that we still want to produce a lot, we want to consume less. That means the stuff we have to produce has to be more investment goods rather than consumption goods. And the opportunity for massive investment around the world is in urban infrastructure. The challenge in making this work is dealing with political risk. Because if you think about building, say, a port or an airport, a water system in some developing country where a new city could emerge, you could collect fees on that, and you could be better off, and the people who move into that city could be better off. Like, people in slums in poor countries pay way more for water than we pay, so that if a firm could come in and just build a modern water system, the poor would have cheaper water, the firm could earn a profit, everybody could be better off. But the risk is that firm has to earn profits on that water system for the next 50 years. And they're worried that a government in 10 years will say, we're reneging on whatever deal some previous government did, and you can't keep collecting your fees on the water system. So if we can come up with a political arrangement that guarantees long-run returns for infrastructure investors, you could match up this huge desire to invest in these huge pools of capital in the rich and fast-growing countries with the desire in the developing world to move into cities. So charter cities is an attempt to come up with special zones, special political governance zones that could be located in developing countries, but that could offer stronger political protections, so that you could get this match of the direct foreign investment and the migration into the new cities.
And Hong Kong is not, even if it's imperfect, right? The idea is you take advantage of all of the labor, the cheap labor, you take advantage of the location, and much of the developing world has good location, but essentially you set up a system of rules that do.
So it was set up under threat of military force, which you would not replicate today. But in effect, the deal was the Chinese put up some land that was unused at the time. The British provided the guarantees, and then the business sector provided the employment opportunities and could invest in the infrastructure, and it was a great opportunity for the people who moved into Hong Kong. It even turned out to be a great advantage for China because it was the seed from which a lot of the subsequent reform took place in China. And some of these zones could be entirely internal to a country because some of the risks are at the state and local level. So when China wanted to replicate the advantages of Hong Kong, they created a special economic zone in Shenzhen, which was right next to Hong Kong, where they grew up another city in this special region, but where the governance was basically controlled from Beijing. So if you look at a place like India, which desperately needs to urbanize, they probably won't invite in some foreign government to guarantee investment. But it could be that Delhi runs competition with the various states and says the first state that can put up a big parcel of land in a couple 1,000 square kilometers will provide big guarantees for, will actually provide from Delhi the kind of legal structure that can guarantee investment there, and then we could build a city of 10 million people very quickly.
And I'll let you save the details for your other presentation, but Honduras is now showing real interest in this.
Yeah.
Right?
So there's some progress in various parts of the world, but more generally, separate from this particular proposal, urbanization is I think in the long run both the most important thing in this century and in many ways the most optimistic. The reason I got started on this was because of that claim I made earlier that formal sector employment was the way to raise skill for people who are already out of school. And if you look at the best way to create formal sector employment for people in the developing world, it's going to be in a city. And in fact, it's going to be in a city on the coast. It's going to be a city on the coast with a port and an airport. And the world just doesn't have enough of these cities.
How are we doing on urbanization? I think we're not doing that well. I don't think we're that serious about urban policy. I've lived much of my life in Washington and New York, two places that span 3 different geographic boundaries that do a terrible job of planning in many ways. You can't take rapid transit to the airport in New York, which is the definition of insanity.
Yeah. Well, I gave a talk in Latin America where I was arguing that what we need to start thinking about now is strong but narrow government. And this is clear when you think about cities. We used to think about like big government versus small. What we need now is strong, narrow but strong. One of the things that impedes strong government is the lack of cohesion from the geographic point of view. So this division into many different subunits, so you don't have anything like executive decision making for the whole area, really impedes decisions that influence dynamics in the whole area. So we would be much better off if we had procedures like annexation that could force political consolidation. And I think, back to my comment about the Congress, we're seeing at the city level more movement towards the strong mayor. We're kind of understanding this point that a very strong executive can actually be a good thing for decision making. And so if we had both more strong mayor movements, so we get rid of school boards, we get rid of city councils, we have executives who can make decisions, but also can make decisions that can internalize all the effects in an entire urban area, we'd do better.
Obviously, some people could say that's less democratic, but you're saying, if anything, it's more. It's democracy with accountability.
Sure. No, I mean, the mayor's got to get elected in New York and Chicago. And so.
Okay. Sir.
To what extent is the gridlock that we're experiencing baked into our Constitution, checks and balances, 18th century ideas of government?
Yeah.
To what extent is that further complicated by things like gerrymandering and the lack of campaign finance reform? And therefore, when you answer that, is there a passage out of here that require things more fundamental than rock, or some basic structures, changes in our Constitution and the way we organize government?
I think our system of divided. The question is, to what extent does the system of government that's enshrined in our Constitution doom us to this kind of gridlock? And I think that it does create very strong checks and this very independent Congress, which as I said, I think is a problem right now. I think within the Constitution, though, we can have mechanisms like the BRAC and the IPAB, and I think those could change how Congress does its business. So at the level of its own rules, I think there's room to address these problems.
To connect to the urban thing, one thing I mean, I don't think we're going to change the Constitution, but I do worry that the Constitution was written in a way that put outsized power deliberately with rural areas at a time when the definition of rural area, the gap between what a rural area and what an urban area was much smaller than it is today.
Two quick points. One is follow up that good question. When you look at not just the separation of powers, but when you look at what Madison says about Congress itself, Federalist 10, it's working exactly the way he designed it to work. That there's going to be a lot of what you call, David, special interests, which he calls factions. They're going to be batting heads, and one of two things is going to come out of it. Nothing, which he thinks is fine, or a general consensus that everybody is pretty assured. Now the BRAC situation, which I lived through at one point, is a very particular solution to a very particular set of situations that didn't affect most of the people voting for it, to tell you the truth. So those voting with losing a military installation in their district could vote no, and everybody understood that. And everybody else who wasn't losing it, that's not the situation of the budget. That's not the normal kind of thing. So I guess my overall point is that you may not like our system of government. You may like a parliamentary system where the prime minister gets everything approved. But this is doing exactly what it was designed to do. And the second real quick point is on colleges. I think your analysis is a brilliant one. I think the discussion was wonderful. But there's more to college than just making a living at the end. And you have to say, there's the measure of making a living, which may be very important for engineering schools. But there is a factor of making a life. And we started out thinking, at least in the undergraduate liberal arts college, that making a life was more important than making a living.
I'll let Paul do Madison, but I'll just say that the research is also very clear that people who go to college are healthier and happier, right? And I understand there's always the causality thing, but when they try to be careful about it, it seems to hold to that.
But on that point, so I think one way to rephrase your question about higher ed is that if you tried to measure what you're producing in higher ed, would that basically undercut some of the good things it does that are hard to measure? And my sense on that is that there's some risk of that, but it's not such a high risk that we couldn't start to measure whether students who leave college can actually write. I just don't see what would be wrong with measuring whether students can write when they leave college. And that's entirely doable. And places like Harvard and Stanford ought to be held accountable for that, just like UNC.
Joe.
But wait, sorry.
Sorry.
On the earlier point about that in some sense, our system is working the way someone like Madison intended for it to work. That, which is basically, if you can't agree, nothing happens. That's fine if the default position is one which is sustainable. But we're now in a position where the default drives us off the cliff and destroys the country. And so paralysis, when you're headed for the cliff and you don't know how close you are, is a frightening thing. So I gotta hope that BRAC-like mechanisms or something will get us out of paralysis, because it's not going to be good if this continues.
Yeah, can I ask you about a question about stand-up? Okay, one area that you're both experts in that you haven't talked about.
No, we're not experts on anything.
Yeah, right. That's why you're there and we're here. Is to what extent has the rampaging growth of the financial sector as a percentage of GDP led us into the economic dilemma that we have now with the accompanying financial speculation? And do you have any ideas about how we can get our best young people back into making products and services instead of goods?
So in case you couldn't hear in the back, the question is, what about the financial sector? in preparation for a talk I gave a month ago, I actually got data on one measure of the total gross output of the financial sector and the healthcare sector and tracked it over the last 40 or 50 years. And this is where I noticed the HMO period and thought about, I saw this thing in the 90s and like, what was going on there? Yeah. But if you look at, and the other thing I was lining it up against is some measure of like the total expenditure or head count or GDP accounted for by government. And the striking thing in our economy, especially since the 1970s, when we all have a sense that things haven't been going quite as well since the 70s, the striking thing is this huge growth of healthcare as a percentage of GDP and the financial sector as a percentage of GDP, and it isn't government, narrowly defined. And I think the fear is that both the healthcare system and the financial sector are not producing better quality of life in proportion to the share of GDP that they're capturing. And I think addressing that.
In terms of the financial sector, you can make the argument that they are hurting our quality of life.
Right, because if you take a very bright some graduate from college and have them go do something in healthcare that pays a high salary but doesn't make the pie bigger, so to speak, you've lost the chance to have that bright young person go do something which makes the pie bigger in a way where we all benefit. And I, well, frankly, this gets back from my perspective this question about the Congress, because I think the administration and both administrations, Bush, Obama, you just go back through the history, the executive branch has always been more thoughtful and proposing better policies about financial sector regulation, and the Congress has stymied their attempts to bring something more sensible, better regulation there. So this gets back to your point, which is that some of these things that are unsustainable are not just, say, decisions the Congress made about entitlements, which now we can't live with, but even things like we have a regulatory system, which I don't think the problem here, by the way, was so much deregulation as the fact that the financial system just was able to evade all of the existing regulation and just innovated their way around all of the existing regulation. So we had a regulatory system which wasn't keeping up with a financial sector that was kind of running circles around the regulators.
I like to bash magic bullets as much as anyone, but there is, I think, something pretty close to a magic bullet here, and Joe Nocera, who will be here this week, has written about it. Force banks to hold more capital. I really think that will accomplish a lot. It won't do everything, but I think if banks have to hold more capital, they will have to hold more cushion against things going bad. I think it will be harder for them to make enormous profits in good times and become a larger part of the economy and then basically get bailed out in bad times. It will do both, right? It will be harder to earn tremendous profits in good times because leverage is one of the best ways to earn profits. More capital is the same thing essentially as less leverage. And in bad times, it'll do it. And so I think that if you're looking for something to watch, are we going to make any progress? It's going to be to see to what extent the stuff in Dodd-Frank that doesn't specify how much capital banks need to hold and think bank-like things, but begins to push us that way. Does it actually happen? We have time for one more question, and I insist that I must call on someone who is not a man, because that is all I've called on. Thank you.
You suggested that Greece could pull out, or basically be pushed out of the euro.
Yeah.
So if that happens, we have to follow that through and say that the systematic risk to all of the European banks, and not just the European banks, but I know that Asia's heavily invested, and I know that some of the American banks are, and that would be a catastrophe somewhat similar to ING if we let it fall. And then you see that after the capital pulls out and try to protect themselves, they'd be literally landing on every other country like Ireland, Spain, followed by states like California and New Jersey. And I mean, you can just see that as the first one falls, you can see how the dominoes could fall, setting up bank after bank after bank to collapse. So when I look at the future, I say not just Greece. Greece is just one of the serious issues that I feel we have, but there's a lot of others.
So to paraphrase, it's going to be awful if Greece pulls out of the euro. And
If what you say happens, you can see how a lot of the world's capital will just pull one by one out of these different
But the debate somehow right now seems to be, it's so awful if it happens that let's not talk about it. And I think we now, and in a way, this was a problem right from the beginning of the formation of the euro, which is they should have said, just like in an airplane manufacturer, the FAA makes you figure out, what are you going to do? What's the procedure you follow if both engines fail in a twin-engine jet? We should have written down, what do we do if there are bank runs and political chaos that lead a country to leave the euro? And nobody's worked that scenario through. Although I'll bet you dinner that there are people in central banks who've got the book worked out on this now. But I think it wouldn't hurt for there to be a little bit more preparation for this. But as you say, it will be extremely disruptive to the financial system.
Thank you all for coming. 5 o'clock is the official opening ceremony. Is that right? Someone correct me if that's wrong. 5 o'clock.